And these golden triangles, their inner proportion is phi. That's the ratio of the baseline to I guess you couldn't call it a hypotenuse because it's a but and you see that in the proportions, actually, believe it or not, of the sort of the rays of the pentagram here being divided like this, being equivalent to this is to this, as this is to this. So that's also phi in the pentagram. So there are numerous depictions of phi, and phi has to do, right? That's the golden ratio, and that has to do with the logarithmic or living spiral. So right there, going back to the Timaeus, right? The psyche cosmou, you have literally, I mean, the scale with which the great architect of the universe has constructed his microcosm, man, and so this whole idea of becoming that perfect pentagram, having the expressing the underlying geometry that the grand architect had created for us, and not allowing that underlying mathematics to be obscured by things like vices and superfluities.
This is Brave New History. I'm here with Ike Baker. We're talking about Freemasonry. Oh, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. And so Ike has a YouTube channel, Arcanum, with a V, because we're highbrow and we got to use the Latin spelling.
It's for style.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for coming on. And we'll be talking about the pentagram, or the 5-pointed star. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the pentagram? There's a lot. There's many ways to go with it, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've given some lectures on it to the Masonic fraternity, and I think it's particularly apropos for that crowd. The pentagram itself obviously it's kind of a standout figure in terms of occult and esoteric symbolism. It seems to be, everybody has seen it and is aware of it as as sort of this esoteric symbol. But Masons have the privilege of understanding these things, or at least they're given the opportunity to understand these things by way of esoteric allegory and analysis. And so I think that's why I like to introduce that to the Masonic fraternity and talk about it. There's a lot about, I think for me is that I don't disagree with it. I don't discredit it. I'm just not interested in any literalist interpretations of Masonry and esoteric symbolism. For what it's worth, I don't expect anybody to take this and be like, and just kind of be like assured that, oh yeah, he must know what he's talking about. But I have my own personal gnosis of the spiritual validity of the allegory of symbol. So I don't need to talk about the star as like, the blazing star of Freemasonry being Sirius, the dog star. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I find more spiritual yield in examining its underlying mathematics through the geometry, like Masonry tells us to do. So
Mhm.
So that's kind of the tack I take on it. Obviously, it's an extremely old symbol, right? It's on record in religious pottery and things like that in ancient Greece from the 7th century BCE. That's a very long time ago, and obviously it was in use in Egypt and in Babylonia, and interestingly also for me, Christians used it. Early Christians
Mhm.
used it as a holy symbol. The Star of Bethlehem, etc. But the one thing that I kind of start out pointing out when I go into uh, the beginning of the lecture, because it's the first in a series of lectures, esoteric geometry series, is that there are lots of signs in the world in general that we take for granted. Traffic signs, this symbolism I've got on the
Mhm.
wall behind me. Uh, the letters on our keyboard. It's all symbols. Now, I think most of us would say those are all attributable. We can attribute meaning to them, and if we all agree they are what they say they are, then that gives them their meaning. And I think that that's right. I think that's correct, except when you're dealing with geometry, because geometry is not invented. Geometry is you're either working in 2 or 3 dimensions, and it's a shape that's telling you something about the mathematical relationship it has to itself, to its potential vertices and underlying mathematics, particularly in things that allude and the 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 pentagram, the 5-pointed star, alludes to, believe it or not, like fractal geometry, believe it or not. So there's things like that are you can't say that you can just project meaning onto them. I mean, you could, but there is also an underlying inherent meaning in geometry, which is why it's so important to the Masonic fraternity, which is why it was so important to the Platonic fraternity, and also to the Pythagorean. And doubtlessly, Pythagoras got, uh, you know, he got he had to have gotten the bulk of his philosophy from parts east, Egypt, and who knows from where. I mean, it's attested in Porphyry's Life of Pythagoras that he spent 22 years studying and geometrizing and astronomizing and being initiated in Egypt. So obviously it's extremely old and it's extremely important.
Yeah, and then there's a lot to that where it's very Platonic, the idea of discovering it rather than, what do you want to say, just inventing it, right?
Right.
That you kind of reverse engineer reality to find how it all began, like, which is where I think Timaeus is coming from. And so, and to
Mm.
our viewers that haven't read Timaeus, a lot of people think Plato is boring and mysterious and whatnot, but like Timaeus is incredible, right? Like the stuff that's in there, where we're going to assume that, well, not assume, we're just going to say that it's probably true that the creator is good because we see so much good stuff, right? And just kind of inferring things from what we see to how we're kind of reverse engineering it. I'm probably not explaining it all that well, but the idea of, it's better to, so you see different shapes, but it's better to understand, uh, how should we put it? Timaeus says it better. I can't recreate it
Yeah,
here, but
well, the whole thing is that, yeah, when we talk about Plato's to agathon, we're talking about the good, but we're not talking about good like Superman doing good. We're talking about order, and that being the highest conception of good, and changelessness, right? Changelessness is reality. Anything that can change can't be real from a philosophical perspective. So if in order for it to be changeless, it has to not be subject to time, so it stands outside of time. And so what is eternal, and what is the source, the generative source of order, That's good. That's the definition of good, not helping
Mhm.
the old lady with her groceries. Good. All those are special examples of the great order, the great divine hierarchical plan, right? And when you do something that is beneficial, you're acting in the spirit of that, acting on the impetus of that divine order. Um, but essentially, the interesting thing is that in the Timaeus we get the demiurge, which is, that
Mhm.
is a subject of that is an entity of much debate in occult circles and religious
Mhm.
circles. It brings up a lot of feelings for people. In So Plato's conception, or at least Plato is telling us through the Pythagorean philosopher Timaeus, that um, this creative entity is the good. But what's interesting is that this creative entity draws out the universe, the cosmos, and he does so like a geometer, like a builder, like an architect. Um, but the interesting thing is that he's using the forms, right? The Platonic forms and the abstracts, the ideals. That's what Plato calls them. Idea, the ideas, otherwise known as the forms, of which geometry, at least in the on the hylic level, or on the mental level, that's the highest manifestation. The highest manifestation of the forms, which apparently, right, according to Plato's sequence, pre-exists the demiurge, because he uses them to create. Uh, and then you see that
That's an interesting
reflected.
point. Yeah. Yeah.
You see Plotinus explain that. Plotinus explains that because he comes up with the whole idea of the three hypostases. So you have tall n, right, the one, that you can only that's you have to subscribe to an apophatic description. You can't say what it is. You have to only describe it in the negative. It's not this, it's not that, because it's everything all at once in potentia, so nothing. But it's the generative force of the generative ground of everything. So you've got, that's the one. Then the intellect, nous, divine mind. That's the capacity of this hypostatic triunity that contemplates whatever's inside the one. All that stuff that's completely undifferentiated, well, the divine mind thinks about them one by one in turn, giving them well, not objective, but I would say differentiated form. It differentiates everything that's in there, that big mystifying, let's conceptualize it like never ending light, just in every direction, everywhere, you completely disorienting. But inside that is everything that has ever or will ever come into existence. It's in potentia. You can't see it. The divine mind, essentially, by contemplating all those different ideas that are latent inside the one, brings them forth as individual ideas. And then the psyche, the soul, um, that is what objectifies it. The soul creates, or really, according to Plotinus, desires those things, and so creates that subject object in more dimensions. But you get the demiurge in the Timaeus, and he's working with the forms in order to create, and that's kind of the justification behind the demiurge being good, because
Mhm.
while he's using perfect forms, so he must be good.
Yeah. And yeah, Timaeus specifically calls out that he's good. It's interesting that, probably most people know the demiurge in terms of Gnosticism, where the demiurge, it's a very similar yet pretty different version of things, where they don't assume that the demiurge is good. But here, it's interesting to notice that demiurge, most of the time it's translated as craftsman, right? Which
Mhm.
would kind of be a bit of interest to Masons. And, I've noticed a good amount of parallels where that we have uh, the Platonic forms, right? Where they talk about how fire is made out of pyramids, right? And then the demiurge constructs the different three-dimensional shapes. He doesn't describe it that way, but you could draw parallels with the orders of architecture, right? And Timaeus, I'm convinced that the middle chamber is imitating Timaeus, the middle chamber lecture, where we have the senses, and then Timaeus goes into the senses. We have the creation of the ideal forms, whereas we talk about the orders of architecture. And then it's not sequential like it is in the middle chamber lecture, but they talk about when you focus on mortal things, you'll be mortal, right? And it's interesting how the staircase begins with the three stages of life. And then we have um, five, where they talk about the senses. And then seven, we have the liberal arts, but it's not quite as arranged quite as neatly as it is in the middle chamber, as it is in Timaeus. And then both of them are describing essentially self improvement, right? And we could be esoteric, or what do we want to say, and call it theurgy that they're practicing. But probably for the everyday person, we'll say brings you closer, like a more spiritual person, closer to God. So in those ways, I've noticed similarities with Plato.
Yeah, I would say that the uh, the the winding staircase, it does parallel that sort of trajectory of development, absolutely. But I would say that, so in order, it was thought in the Neoplatonic school, particularly of the Amblician school. I'm pretty sure he says it explicitly. In order to practice theurgy, in order to be a true philosopher, you have to learn everything. You can't allow anything to go unlearned. Period. End of story. Uh, and then you're ready for theurgy. So yeah, what happened was, I believe it started out by, I think Porphyry organized them first into six virtues, the ladder of virtues from the Platonic dialogues, and then they ascend. Basically, they start right
Mhm.
um, with natural virtue, which is the body. Um, and Plato doesn't really talk too much about that at length. It's there, obviously, but it would have been stressed. It would have been covered, right? He was a wrestler. There was a space and a time for everybody to practice gymnastics and wrestling in the academy before they began their discourse. Uh, and then you would move up to the ethical virtues, how to walk uprightly and give everybody a square deal, and then the civic virtues. Now you're branching out and being a boon to the community. Right, you have an obligation, right? Every human in the world has a claim to your kind offices. It's not just this little tribal me, my family. I'm going out and I'm applying this sort of temperance and proactive courage and balance, really, to my community. And then from there, you start moving on to the cathartic virtues and the contemplative virtues, and then the paradigmatic virtues. So cathartic is purificatory. Really, you start realizing where you have unhealthy attachments to your physical body and your life, and you slowly start to pull that apart and get some space between that. And then the contemplative is much more philosophical. In the Amblician school, you would have started to contemplate the Platonic forms at that point, and get into that abstract mental level. And then finally you'd go to the paradigmatic level, which is a little more abstract. It's basically, you are embodying the archetypes of the universe. You are sort of linking your soul to the psyche cosmos, the soul of the world that he mentions in the Timaeus, and by extension, uh, becoming a demiurge in miniature. And then Iamblichus added the seventh virtue, the hieratic or the theurgic. So you had to right, you had to ascend this whole staircase, and it was just prerequisite before you could practice theurgy. That's
Mhm.
just the very you're getting, you're getting ready to begin at that point, which is mind blowing, and that is, to me, it's reflected in Masonry's constant admonition to improve yourself. Like, look, this is right. That's I mean, that's the entered apprentice. That's the whole thing is
Mhm.
to to chip away at the rough edges of the rough ashlar, and that those are those first three virtues, and then from there we're getting into more philosophical, right, things like the liberal arts and things like that. And then that seventh virtue raises you essentially above all the terrestrial stuff that you just learned.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. That it's interesting how we have that theological ladder that Jacob in his vision saw, right? Faith, hope, charity. There was a medieval monk who came up with this ladder, a whole bunch of rungs, right? And it's a theurgical ladder. And the first three rungs are faith, hope, and charity. And it's a common theme with theurgy that the among the first steps is to subdue your passions, right? And that's what I can't
Yeah.
remember the name here, but there was a monk that came up with this idea, and yeah, that's what maybe the first three steps of the staircase refer to as faith, hope, charity. But I don't think that's mentioned in any version of the lecture, is it? I don't think it is. Um,
the the attribution of the staircase
yeah,
to faith, to the three virtues, not in, I believe not in the North Carolina jurisdiction, but I do know it's mentioned.
yeah.
Faith, hope, and charity are mentioned in the well, and obviously um prudence and fortitude are added to those in the EA trestle board, but those are also Platonic.
Hmm.
Those come from Plato. The seven liberal arts come from the Republic. It wasn't it wasn't formalized as an educational sort of
Hmm.
curriculum or method until the Middle Ages. And though Plato coined the term rhetoric, he meant it in a pejorative sense rather than as it was taught in universities. For many years, he he accused the sophists of what he called rhetoric, which wasn't something that he didn't have a whole lot of respect for that. As a matter of fact, he found it to be manipulative, and
Hmm.
it was a pantomime of real philosophy, true people, or true love of wisdom.
Yeah. So you had said demiurges in miniature. I like that idea. That you wonder if the early speculative Masons have thought of that. I would imagine they would have.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny because so you have Plato bring up the seven liberal arts as a curriculum of study that would need to be undertaken uh by the perfect ruler, right? The most perfected sovereign. And then what you have is you have this classical liberal arts education, liberal not as in progressive, not as in left, liberal as
Mhm.
in libera, meaning it will free you, because it will teach you to think, and through there your choices will be based in freedom. Obviously that's not really something that we value very much anymore in the Western higher educational institutions, and most of them anyway. But what's interesting is that it's really through that course of education that Plato kind of is introduced, or at least has the opportunity to be introduced to Masonry in full force by things like the lectures, the Preston Webb stuff. Those were not traditionally part of stonemasons rituals. They or the early Masonic rituals. Those were created obviously based on a lot of research and a lot of, he interviewed many of the what would have been elders of the Freemasonic Society of their time, and came up with these beautiful degree lectures that inculcate certain virtues and certain studies, and chief among them being geometry, really. So you see a lot of that stuff, the trestle board stuff from the lectures, Euclid's 47th problem. These things would have been made available to, particularly in that verbiage, it would have been made available, or would have been familiar to the gentry, the nobility that was entering masonry at that time, late 1600s, early mid 1700s, and then just persisting throughout, becomes sort of this gentleman's fraternity, right? When originally, according to the most reliable extant historical data we have, it most likely did come out of blue collar, illiterate, mostly. They knew how to draw. You had to know how to draw geometrically perfectly, but that it didn't mean that you needed to know how to write or read, and many times they didn't. So, but it becomes this gentleman's fraternity, and of course that's really when this kind of highfalutin liberal arts and Platonizing really came through, right? Because they would have been teaching Plato and Aristotle in particular at that point. And you do see it in Masonry, like you were saying earlier about the Platonic dialogues. People who are reading them and find it boring, it's just my opinion. I'm not saying this is a fact, but I like to have a little fun and joke around sometimes. People who read the Platonic dialogues and come away like, I feel like they don't understand it. I feel like they're reading
100%.
it the way some people read like Shakespeare, like just completely no precision of understanding of the words, like how people get that mixed up. That famous line from Romeo and Juliet, "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" People think that means, "Where are you, Romeo?" It means,
Mhm.
"Why are you, Romeo?" And there's a big difference. And I think that's the same kind of misinterpretation that's going on, misreading or really lazy reading of Plato that's happening. But they're mystical documents. And the Aristotelian stuff, not so much.
Mhm.
There's still that, right? He writes about metaphysics, but he's more the empiricist and the technician of logic. So you see kind of that being more dominant, but we allude to the mystic stuff. Like, it's there behind the veil. You've just got to get
Mhm.
to the Platonic. You have to go through the Aristotelian. That's kind of the way it's set up in the Masonic lectures, to my thought, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting how, just like we have speculative and operative Freemasonry, where we're talking about building stuff, right? There's also the idea in the Timaeus. It's like the substances like earth and fire, they're made of stuff, right? These triangles, right? That the fire is made out of pyramids. And that's how we get alchemy, right? But he doesn't say that. But I think that was the understanding of the time, and that's kind of where the ideas came from, right? And so, like, we're getting, he's saying so much without saying it. And maybe there's a little bit of it where we're reading into it, right? Like, right before Timaeus gets into his big monologue, they're recapping the Republic, right? And a lot of that, there has to be a lot to it, right? But it seems pretty straightforward. But you would think, because people have just gone through it so much, that like each sentence would get, huge amount of commentary on it, right? Like this is we're looking at this, that even something as simple as when it begins, like Socrates is counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Where's the other guy here, right? You're wondering if that has some mystical significance to it as well, right? But so when I read Timaeus, there's like you can see Genesis in it, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it seems to be allusion to the Elohim. We might have like references from Atlantis to the conquest of Canaan or the destruction of the Tower of Babel, right? Certainly in what is it, Criticus? There seems to be some parallels with the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Critias. Yeah. Or
Yeah,
Cratylus.
yeah. I'm not terribly sure. I just read it. I don't talk about it a whole lot. But just the other day, I learned that it's pronounced pedagogy, not pedagogy, which is I like. I've always seen the word, but it's
The thing
interesting
is
how.
though,
Yeah,
you got to understand something. I'm a native Greek speaker because I'm modern Greek. Obviously, I don't speak Attic or Koine
not
Greek.
quite in Greek, right?
No, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But the I understand that dead languages. It's like not. There's no way of really knowing, but from and if you ask most Greek speakers or Greek people, they'll probably agree with this. The anglicized pronunciation of the Greek words is a travesty. So like pronounce it whatever you're comfortable with because there's no right way. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then you're just like Plato is such a base text for so much that I've seen documentaries on the Nephilim where we get this idea of what's going on there. And as I'm reading Timaeus, I'm like, yeah, I think it actually comes from Plato. Like this seems to be the origin of that concept. But then most people, I think, would date the Pentateuch before Plato. Is that right? So you wonder what's going on there, but there seems to be so much overlap where I'll let you get a word in. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I mean, it's a good point, and it's definitely worth um it's definitely worth thinking about. There's just like so much there that I want to touch on.
Mhm.
I would say, yeah, absolutely. The uh the I have found striking parallels between, obviously, right? Anybody who's read the Timaeus, it sounds like Genesis, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
Mhm.
the thing is though, the issues with dating. All right, so you look at Pentateuch, right? Why does Pentateuch, why is that composed of Greek words? If it's Hebrew, Pent is Greek, right? So because all of the Hebrew scriptural canon was translated, well, I will say most of it, a great amount of it was translated into Greek during the Hellenistic era. So Hellenized Judaism is ultimately the tradition that it's the blending of the Hebrew religion with Hellenistic thought, particularly around Alexandria, Egypt, around the the last few centuries BCE to the first few centuries CE. I want to say the 4th century, probably a safe bet. Um, that gives us Hellenized Judaism, from which Merkaba mysticism comes, and eventually, right, the Kabbalah. Actually, if we're going just based on historical
Mhm.
data, the Kabbalah is Greek. Period. End of story.
Mhm.
It could be Egyptian. We don't really know, but if we're going on what we have, it existed in Greece. It's very well attested, way
Yeah,
before it existed in the Hebraic region. And we see directly the cross pollination of Hellenized Judaism
yeah,
right there after the Alexandrian conquest. And so the thing is, the issue with dating Hebrew texts is that there is a very strong or like inculcated sense of oral tradition, which is fine. I mean, there's an oral tradition. There are unwritten doctrines and everything. It's even in Plato, right? In Aristotle's Physics and Metaphysics, he mentions in both of those major works within the Platonic school is the agrapha dogmata, the unwritten doctrine. So we know, of course, but you can't base historical validity on oral tradition. So that like the traditional dating is like, I want to say like 12,000 BCE or whatever, or 1200 to 1400 BCE is like the traditional oral dating of the Mosaic Hebrew scriptural canon. But realistically, modern scholars have kind of found one way or another, by dating techniques, by the type of Hebrew that they have. There was Proto Hebrew. There's all sort of Semitic variations of this stuff that evolved. They are actually the Timaeus and the Psalms and Genesis are actually most likely, according to current scholarship, contemporary with each other. They were probably written around the same time. Dating. I don't want to step on anybody's toes. It's not to say that I don't believe in the oral tradition, but I'm saying with what the evidence that's available to us, which from where we stand, that's what I have to defer to. That's typically where that comes from. But you see a lot of things are birthed at the same time as the Platonic documents. Eudoxus, for instance, was a student of Plato, and it's like within 5 years of Plato writing, right? Because they can't precisely date. You can sort of you can approximately date this stuff. There's a window. It's very difficult unless there's multiple attestations that explicitly say what year it was written. And even then it's difficult. But right around that time, like a 5-year window, Eudoxus, who was a student of Plato, he creates what would become the Ptolemaic model of the universe, which was the dominant, quote unquote, geocentric model of the universe that we used that was, commonly accepted for at least 1500 years. But that occurred. He came up with that theory right at the time Plato was writing the Republic and released it. And we know that in Book 10 of the Republic, at the end of Book 10 is the myth of Ur. And the myth of Ur describes exactly 8 concentric spheres, and beyond which lies the non-causal realm where souls go when they die. And it's shaped like 8 nested spheres. So you've got Plato writing that. He must have been talking about it, teaching it. You've got a student of his who then comes out, contemporaneously with that work, this idea, and it passes through time. Now, the tricky thing there is the word student, because the Platonic Academy Plato didn't have like cadres. He wasn't standing in front of people necessarily and giving a lecture and them taking notes. It was much more discursive. There was conversation. There were different types of words that they referred to the people who gathered there, like friend, companion, associate, disciple. It wasn't the way we would imagine like a modern, I guess, teacher student, black and white relationship there. So there's that to think about as well.
Yeah. And when it comes to dating and just figuring out how everything works in terms of how it fits together, that when we have Genesis, and it occurred to me the other night, that Timaeus, there's a section where he says, all right, and now here, let me get into something entirely different and kind of start over from scratch a bit, right? And that reminded me a whole lot of the discontinuity between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right? And I wonder, since it seems to me that one is imitating the other, right? That, what if that whole discontinuity between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, that's imitating Timaeus? It's not because that there's the garden narrative was first, and then they tacked on the celestial let there be light account. What if there's the discontinuity because they're like, all right, we got to imitate Timaeus here, and we're going to kind of basically start the story over again, which kind of throws out where we are in terms of biblical scholarship. But it just makes me wonder, right? And what what were the biblical writers? What were they thinking about with like Timaeus specifically says God is not a jealous God, right? But then Genesis expressly says that, right? I think that's in Genesis, isn't it? And then it specifically says that before the universe and while the universe was being created, there wasn't any time, right? Where Genesis specifically calls out 7 days, right? And you wonder, like, there's so many parallels that line up. And then there's these two words, like the word jealous, if that's a tick mark or not, right? Um, but yeah, so lots of thoughts in terms of that and what's going on with the Bible and whatnot and scholarship.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's fascinating, particularly because of the outcropping of Christianity as a sort of mystery religion. Um, it it happens, right? The Christ event, as I like to sort of refer to it, because I'm a Christian. I'm not, I'm somebody who. That's not to say that I'll put it this way. I'll paraphrase. I'll borrow a quote from one of my favorite authors of the early 20th century, Dion Fortune. I am a Christian. I love Christianity, but I don't care about churchianity. And I've heard the arguments about why that doesn't make sense, and I don't care. So for whatever that's worth. But still, right, coming from a historical perspective on this stuff, which we have to do, that has to be a part of it, and it has to have its own domain of authority. You really see Christianity as more of a Hellenistic thing than it is a Hebrew thing.
Yeah.
Hands down, 110%. It's
Yeah.
way more Hellenistic than it is. It's tied to Hellenism. It's tied to Neoplatonism. On the other hand, it relies on a set of scriptural canon that is explicitly Hebrew, right? That whole messianic through line. But there's confluence with all of them in Hellenistic Alexandrian Egypt. Really, you have Serapis Christos, as he was called. The official cult god of the Ptolemaic dynasty. You have Hellenized Judaism. You have Hermetism, which was Hellenized Egyptian religion, and then you have Neoplatonism, which was, I want to say, Oriental or reorientalized Platonism. And then obviously that was the Platinian iteration. When you get the Amblichian iteration, he actually relies again more on the Egyptian stuff. So it's just this. It's like I picture it like taking two things and just blending them together and kneading them together like some kind of dough, and then what you end up with is Christianity somehow. And it's particularly in Alexandria of the first century of the Common Era, it's Gnostic. And Gnostic Christianity is fantastic because it preserved the cosmological model as an operative system, which we don't do. No other form of Christianity that we have on record does that. Gnostics were practicing baptismal theurgy and using maps, Platonic maps of the cosmos, which is in order to figure out, okay, where are we going? Where else do you see that? You see that in Merkaba mysticism, right? That comes from Hellenized Judaism in Alexandria. The mystic enters, it goes into vision, and he goes downward. It's sort of a katabatic thing, but only to go upward. And the chariot takes him forth to 7 planetary spheres, at which he meets hostile, angelic, quasi-angelic entities that try and stop him from leaving. The whole goal of the Merkava mystic is to get outside that 8th sphere and behold the throne of God. And they stop him, and it's Platonic cosmology, especially by way of Porphyry. And we see Porphyry's astral garments and the accretions of the soul, we see that directly mirrored in the Pymander. When the Pymander's
Mhm.
talking about what happens to the soul after the death of the body, you go up to the first sphere and you shed a vice. You go up to the second sphere, you shed a vice. Porphyry took the Platonic cosmology and he said, no, when you incarnate, you take on the vice and virtue. And when you go down, you take on the
Mhm.
vice, you take on the virtue. And
Mhm.
so it's the same thing. That's why, and I talk to a lot of academics, and I love them. A lot of them are great friends and they're doing fantastic work, but I don't fully understand how anyone can say that this stuff isn't like completely related. It's to me it seems like one river with various tributaries. From the way that I've studied it and the amount of work I've been able to examine, and you see that attested to in people like Zosimus of Panopolis. He was a great synthesizer of everything we just talked about: Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Hermetism. How was he able to do that so successfully if they're not all related?
Yeah. Or they come to similar ideas that are um, complementary to each other, right? That you talked about as you're ascending, you remove various vices, right? That's also in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, right? Um, and yeah, the similarities are just crazy, and the whole like the metaphor of the ocean, I think you'd mentioned, or the tides, that yeah, the even in Timaeus they're talking about Egypt, right? That this comes to us from Egypt, and what weren't the I might be off, but the pillars that were supposed to survive fires and floods, was that Egyptian? Did the Egyptians make that
Yeah.
according to him?
Yeah,
Yeah.
those were the pillars of Hermes actually, and they were supposed to have uh, survived the fire and the flood. That's preserved in Egyptian and particularly Hellenistic Egyptian, um, like sort of
Mhm.
Hermetic lore.
Yeah, Josephus mentions it as well. And I was thinking that they're supposed to be freestanding pillars, right? And on the outside of them they have knowledge written on it. And you would imagine, I think they say specifically knowledge of astrology, right? And you would think that it would make sense to people to have like a globe on top of them, right? Which is what we have here. I'm not saying that anybody's ever said that, but I wonder if that wasn't the thinking to create Jacob and Boaz. And in the Masonic ritual, I don't think it's in the Bible where they talk about it's supposed to store anything, those pillars, right? Um, I've heard like in the Hebrew Pentateuch, they're in no, it doesn't even appear. The Enochic pillars don't appear in the canon, do they?
No, I don't think
Um,
so. I'm not really recalling. But when you say that the pillars aren't supposed to store something, the first thing that comes to my mind again is the Hermetic myth, because the in the Hellenistic or Egyptian Hellenistic sort of lore surrounding, really specifically alchemically. This is
mhm.
this is referring to the alchemical knowledge, but all the knowledge of the universe was encapsulated inside the pillars of Hermes Trismegistus. He wrote stuff on the outside, but really it was on the interior of the pillar, which is funny because I was reading something last night. It might have been Apollonius of Tyana. I forgot who exactly it was, but it was a very famous sort of magician from that time period, and his students were no. This was okay. Zosimus is recalling a tale of Ostanis of Mendes, Ostanis the Persian, and he talks about how a teacher died, a great teacher, before he taught them like the final transmutation of elements, and it's just interesting because it's an interesting synchronicity that we're talking about again tonight. But so the students are sitting around the temple and they're lamenting, oh, we'll never learn, now he's dead. And all of a sudden a pillar bursts open and all of the information they were looking for, all of the teaching comes flooding out. So apparently this is a pretty common trope in that, that time period, the first few centuries CE. But obviously, the Hebrew scriptural canon would have been written, probably like 600 years, 700 years before, the 4th century CE.
Yeah. So you're drawing parallels with the Hieronic legend, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's to me, it's all one way or another for me. It's Hellenistic, which is to say that it's a mixture, not even a mixture. I would say it's an interpretation of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman. Romans kind of peripherally, but they had a huge part in it. They were the overarching government and infrastructure for many, many years. They loved Greek philosophy, so they poured money into these things, which helped them grow and build and become these massive institutions, rather than a bunch of men just meeting in a park, which was essentially what the Academy Grove. But it comes from that exchange and interplay. And the thing is, a lot of people will say, okay, around that time you have the corpora of these various schools, and they're written in Greek because Greek was the lingua franca at the time. But the thing is, they have not only a unified cosmology, they have a unified terminology. And so that doesn't just mean the words are Greek. It means there are specific entities that they're referring to. It's like the daimones, and things like that, the heroes, and they're using the logoi, logos. They're using these metempsychosis, they're using a unified set of terminology that is highly specific, and points to specific sort of elements and entities, really, of this quasi-astro-theological worldview. So to me, it all kind of happened then. To me, it's a seedbed of Western esotericism. And Christianity is a huge part of Western esotericism, whether anybody would like to admit that or not.
Yeah, you said what was the last thing you said about Freemasonry is the seedbed of Western
No,
esotericism?
that era of Hellenization, it was the seedbed. I would say Freemasonry is the custodian of it through the last several hundred years. I would say that it passed through Freemasonry, but I would, and this is no pejorative, I think Freemasonry does wonderful things for men, does wonderful things for the community, does wonderful things for erudition and for the fraternity. But I would say that in the last couple of 100 years, I feel like the last 100, really, because even in the early 20th century, you had guys like Wilmshurst writing, and he was unbelievable. Truly, truly on the mark, incredibly insightful, and deeply spiritual man. Then you have, on the other hand, you have like Joseph Fort Newton, who put together a beautiful Masonic history, The Builders. It's a classic. I love it. I loved reading it, but it's on the other end. It's literalist. It's not, there is no poetry to his writing. There's no mystical element. But I would say that it passed in a way that the symbols largely passed in the same way like an original Picasso would remain preserved, because it's in somebody's attic and they don't really know that they have it up there. So I would say that's but the interesting thing is, right, well, where do you get the real esoteric interpretations of this stuff? Well, people have been wondering that for 300, 400 years. Because because not everybody's going to want to talk about this stuff. Not every lodge wants to talk about Hermes Trismegistus. I mean, trust me, I'm in the South, so it's like, it's and that's okay. It's perfectly fine. But you have the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I mean, they're an outcropping of Rosicrucian Freemasonry that explicitly, it's Masonic ritual, but they've incorporated other stuff. Most of the symbols that they study are related to either craft Freemasonry or one of the appended bodies. You look at Martinism, right, or the Elu Cohen. Those were supposed to be rectified versions of what Freemasonry was. It was their esoteric interpretation. For Martinez de Pasquale, who created the Martinist system, really, he had somehow, right, in the 1700s, he had Sethian Gnosticism, which blows my mind. It could have been from proximity to the Cathars 100 years before, but he has kind of like this Solomonic, Christianized Solomonic grimoire thing that he does through Masonry. You have Cagliostro's Rite of Memphis and of Mizraim. You have Jean-Baptiste Villermo's The Rectified Scottish Rite. So you have a lot of esoteric interpretation coming out of Freemasonry, but within, standard Blue Lodge Freemasonry, you don't see that level of esotericism and mystic contemplation and engagement with those symbols generally, right? I mean, I'm only one person. I can't claim to have time traveled, but this is the overarching sentiment of Freemasonry within the last 200 or 300 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there's not a lot of esoteric in Blue Lodge, although you can connect dots and get there. Especially, I mean, if you're familiar with it to begin with, right? Like theurgy, they love the symbol of stairs. And I forget who it was, maybe Alamblicus, that you have to ascend inward and upward. Some Neoplatonists said that. But you wonder if that might have inspired the winding staircase, right? Inward and upward, right?
Yeah,
But
I mean, I think that's kind of his description of the ladder of virtues as well, that we kind of touched on. There's also, I'm not sure that it's a direct correlation, but there's also the ladder of Jacob. It could have something to do with it, particularly because in modern Freemasonry, right? I mean, it's typically it's primarily Old Testament Christianity.
Yeah. And in the symposium, the ladder of love. And I've heard it's not explicitly said in which one? Well, and with the ladder of love, which is in the symposium, that it starts with love of the physical, and then it becomes love of beauty itself, right? So we can kind of see the similarities with the good, right? And like love of God versus love of physical things, right? And it like kind of, as you were saying, it all ties in with like the cave, right? We're loving uh illusionary shapes, right, on the cave wall versus, love of the light outside the cave.
Right, which creates those shapes. It's that that's the hard thing, is to see something that's fake and fall in love with it, and then to see the reality behind it and having to give up what you love.
Yeah.
That's the whole, that's the gnosis of the first part of the allegory of the cave. That's the hard part, right? We could talk about it in terms of what it says, but the reality of the situation, if you live that experience, that's the challenge of the allegory of the cave. But there's something really interesting going on there. If you look at Philo, particularly his commentary or interpretation of the allegory of the cave being the world of daylight being the noetic realm, the pleroma, and then and you see that again reiterated in Porphyry's commentary on the Cave of the Nymphs. He points to the fact that, look, anytime we talk about a cave, we're talking about, anytime we talk about the underworld, we're talking about the physical cosmos. We're not talking about in the earth. We're talking about below the noetic realm, the pleroma. The underworld is where you are now.
Yeah, it reminds me of Game of Thrones, right? There's only one hell, the one we live in now.
Yeah,
Which I think
basically.
is, yeah, yeah. And as a tangent with Mithraism, you wonder if that's not informed by the allegory of the cave, right? How they met in Mithraea, and I don't know if there's anybody's ever thought of offering an explanation for why they met in fake caves. Oftentimes, if a real cave wasn't available, and the symbolism of taking in the bull, and apparently the the striking of the bull
The Tauroctony.
happens in the cave. What's that?
The Tauroctony.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Well, I mean, like in terms of where it's supposed to be happening, right, is within a cave. I might be off, but maybe that was just
Well, I think
speculation.
I think that at least, excuse me, at least from my understanding of the architecture of the Mithraeum was there were benches on the side. It was typically very tight, and at the end of the hall, it kind of looked like a Masonic lodge, right?
That was my
Benches on both sides,
opinion. Yeah.
like exactly. And the whole thing is that, like, really, it's an allegory for the sun. The slaying of the bull, and then you also have you also have the scorpion that's always
Hmm.
kind of like nipping at his testicles, and that having an allusion to like this is all just kind of, I don't have any precision with with this symbolism, just because of how little there is to study.
Hmm.
But I think that I had read somewhere that had to do with the proximity of Scorpio to the we're talking about constellations here. uh but I think it was at the end of the hall, I guess, we're in a Masonic lodge you would call the East, that they had depicted the Tauroctony, the slaying of the bull by Mithra. So yeah, I think it was I think it might have been eastward, or as you're saying, to your point, at least it was depicted in the Mithraeum, in the cave.
Yeah. Well, you wonder if. Do you think it might be informed by the allegory of the cave that they meet in caves, or I I wonder.
I think personally, I don't know if it was specifically influenced by the allegory of the cave so much as it was likely influenced, I think, at a very very elemental level. I think a lot of this symbolic, really, I'm saying mythicism, right? Because that's what we do when we create dramatic ritual. When we curate a ritual space and we have ritual gesture and ritual movement and ritual words, it's mythicism. We're creating and enacting a myth, and that is a form, right? That is a physical
Mhm,
form that we're giving to something that's much more abstract, right? We are grounding those particular ideals that are associated with the intent of this thing. And we're expressing them, and we're putting somebody through them, really, is the most, that the whole thing is like, okay, yeah, we've got this beautiful analogy, we've got this beautiful allegory, but it will really affect you if you have to go through it. So I think that is informed by that the catabatic tradition in Orphic times, in Homeric times. I think, because Porphyry's commentary on the Cave of the Nymphs comes from Homer. He's saying like, no, look, in the Iliad here, when they're like down in this cave with all these nymphs, with the two gates, right? Which again, that's the circumpunct, you know, and the two lines, the symbols of the holy saints, John. But you're talking about the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn, and that was conceived of as being the two gates through which a soul incarnated and disincarnated, came into the physical world and left it. And that was the whole point of Porphyry's commentary on the Cave of the Nymphs. But this is a Homeric thing he's talking about there. It's very old. It's like an ancient way of symbolizing the soul's descent into matter. And I think that came from Egypt. I can't say as to if it came earlier, right? Nobody can say anything about that. So, but I think it's much more. I think if anything, Plato's allegory of the cave was based on that. So it's kind of like this truism. It was this thing that a lot of people would have already been familiar with for like hundreds of years. It was sort of an archetype that was still used in ancient societies, I think, at that time.
Yeah. And, it's probably overused. I'm sure it is, where there's something archetypal about it, right? That makes it especially true. And that's why people really, I mean, when you see different ideas with no seeming genetic connection, we can just kind of say, well, it's kind of an archetype a little bit. Although I see that explanation used for virtually everything, so I'm reluctant to say that.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's something about a cave can mean so much as a symbol.
Yeah. And I think it changes as, you know, as societies morph. That's not so a cave is not something you and I experience. I would be hard pressed to find five people that I know that have been inside of a cave. So it's like, back then might have been more of a thing. Whereas now that's not really a useful archetype to us. Not only that, but think of it this way. Caves are damp. That was actually part of Porphyry's whole thing. There was this belief back then that like souls like humidity. A soul incarnates because it wants to feel the moisture of the human body, the blood, the sweat. This was a
Mhm.
thing that was big back then. And so there's humidity in caves most of the time. They're uncomfortable, they're dank, they're a realm of darkness, of unsurety. We don't live those lives. I am talking to you from the comfort of a beautiful library. I have some food. I've got nice drink. Our lives aren't, you know, we don't have to like change clothes in the middle of the day because the sun may char our skin like a lot of these ancient people back. They lived with much more discomfort. It was a much more, they were harder, sterner folk, largely. And so I think the idea of a cave being an archetype of that kind of existence was more salient for them. It could work for us if we decided to reappropriate it and sort of enliven the mythic egregore of that thing. I think it
Mhm.
could. I mean, from my standpoint as a practicing ceremonialist, I think that may have a very interesting effect on the psychology of the person going through that kind of reappropriation and integration of a cave as a symbol of incarnation and the material realm. So that's something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, you think that if you take your degrees in a cave, just by comparison, seeing it in a regular lodge room would be unimpressive, right? That would like that would be the high point. But who
Yeah,
knows? Or maybe you just may need to make it like cave lodge, 480, right? That we meet in a cave.
I'm down, man. I'd see if we can get chartered. Okay, but we have in Asheville at 80 Broadway, where Mount Herman and many other great lodges meet. We do have a rustic lodge, and it's tradition that we go down there to vote every year. And it's basically it looks like a cave if the interior were cubed, and it's pretty cool. These pedestals that we have in the stations um, are actually hewn tree logs, which is really cool.
Mhm.
So it's very very. We only use it to to vote. We don't do ritual down there though, but it might be cool. Might be something
Yeah,
to investigate.
absolutely. Or if someone has just too much money and time on their hands, they could create a Mithraeum and have lodge there. That'd be a neat idea. But to get enough people who would appreciate what that is, right, would be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, depending on where you are, for sure. Yeah.
Um, so let's see the pentagram, or if you've said everything that you wanted to say on that, maybe we can return back to the pentagram.
Yeah. So the basis of the pentagram, right? The pentagram was kind of the holy symbol of the Pythagoreans. It's how they identified each other, etc. But it's really been a staple of initiation in particular for a really long time. And there are a number of allusions to the numeral 5 throughout Masonic ritual and
Mhm.
just in general throughout the composition of really a human. That's one of the arguments that I make in the lecture. The idea of the five senses and the five appendages and things like this. But what we understand about it is that, and the thing is that this is typically a lecture that requires several diagrams because for me to like explain lineal phi is a little, I'm not sure I could do it with words. Although Plato does it in the allegory of the divided line in
Mhm.
in the Republic. So if you ever want to actually take what he says there and physically draw it out, you'll be creating phi, which is that's a hidden mathematical proportion right there in within the Republic. And actually, I was not to get too far off topic. Sometimes to get me to talk about one thing is like hurting cats, but
Mhm.
it's but I've been reading something. This is just an aside for anyone who's interested. Been reading something recently, which is essentially the author's name escapes me, so I'll look it up. But the musical structure of Plato's dialogues, um, and it's pretty interesting because it was first kind of found out uh, looking at the Republic. So there's actually a planned, like okay, so it's J.B. Kennedy. The musical structure of Plato's dialogues. It's basically a floor plan, a blueprint that he made that follows a certain meter, specifically having to do with musical poems and things like that. And it's in a lot of his work. But um, that aside, the pentagram has within it an underlying geometry or an underlying mathematics that is expressive ultimately by way of. So if you see, well, and it's funny because I, I didn't plan this. It just happened to be here. I swear to God. But you these right the vertices, right? I guess we call them points right here. They create when it's done like this, right? I
Mhm.
actually I used the formula for geometrically creating a pentagram here. When it's done like this, it will create two things. It'll create a regular pentagon, and it will create 5 golden triangles. And these golden triangles, their inner proportion is phi. That's the ratio of the baseline to I guess you couldn't call it a hypotenuse because it's a but and you see that in the proportions actually, believe it or not. um of the sort of the rays of the pentagram here being divided like this, being equivalent to this is to this as this is to this. So that's also phi in the pentagram. So there are numerous depictions of phi, and phi has to do, right? That's the golden ratio, and that has to do with the logarithmic or living spiral. So right there, going back to the Timaeus, right? The Psyche Cosmou, you have literally, I mean, the scale with which the great architect of the universe has constructed his microcosm, man, and so this whole idea of becoming that perfect pentagram, having the expressing the underlying geometry that the grand architect had created for us, and not allowing that underlying mathematics to be obscured by things like vices and superfluities, right? And so in that way, we are better fit for the builder's use. When we reflect the more perfect virtues of our underlying design, when the personality, the physicality of Ike matches more perfectly the archetype of Ike that was in the creator's mind when I came forth as an idea, as we all do. That rectification is ultimately what Masonry is pointing to. I believe it's also what Platonism pointed to.
Yeah. When you wonder with the symbol of the rough and perfect ashlar, right? That maybe the perfect ashlar is the ideal, and then we're kind of making ourselves into the mirror image, right? Because you can't turn back into an idea really,
Right.
but you can kind of become that physically.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing, is that, look, if the point isn't to become the idea, that the point is to embody it. That's the whole distinction that I don't get on board with the whole non-dualist kind of like sort of, it's all good type of mentality, and this, I guess, aversion completely towards the material, this kind of, nothing matters here anyway type of stuff that I'm seeing come out of some sort of bastardized spirituality community. But I think that the point is self-evident, that if we are here, and if there is this work to be done, if there is this quarrying that we have to do, and this perfection of the rough stone that has to take place, then it's for a reason. I don't claim to know that reason, and that's why I love Masonry, because it embodies it perfectly in the line, the better to fit us for the builder's use. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm not the builder. I'm the workman. I'm the craftsman. I'm the one that has to chip away the rough edges and create, with help of the master, of course, to create the perfect ashlar. The better, the better to fit myself for the builder's use ultimately, which, I mean, if to me, that implies a teleology. There's a telos to that, right? Telos being a reason, teleology being the study of something's purpose rather than its, just as phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And there's something Platonic. You wonder what Plato would say, or Socrates, with, like, we have the trestle board. That's the idea, right? And then we're let's create that, right? That maybe we're reading into it a bit, right? Or that's just how it is, right? Like if we're Masons, we're building things that you have to start with the idea and you have to make it physical, right? That we don't even have to. I mean, that it's just like how we're really discovering geometry. We're not inventing it. Just as like we would necessarily see the similarities between the ideal and the physical, right? That we don't even need Plato to come to those ideas.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, what a lot of us are lacking in is historical perspective. Just stop and think for a moment what it must have been like to be an ancient Egyptian or ancient whomever and have no knowledge of building. And one day you're however old and you're walking past a clearing. And it's just sand. And then at some later point, you walk past that clearing again and there's a pyramid there. I mean, and men made that. There was nothing there, and if you're not educated in that stuff, everybody's a little educated in everything nowadays. Back then, that wasn't the case. You know what I'm saying? Like most people were not literate. It was considered a species of magic to be able to read hieroglyphics. You know what I'm saying? Like scribes were like, not even all priests could read hieroglyphics at some point, right? Because some priests were janitors, some priests prepared food, some priests prepared medicine, but scribes were in charge of everyone. And that's from a pyramid text. I can't give you which one right now off the top of my head. It's actually in the pyramid text. Like actually it was a scholastic text. It was a text that they used to teach. And basically they were inculcating in students the scribe is the head guy. If you're going to learn, you want to be a scribe because they're in charge of everyone's work because they're the only ones that can write this stuff out and record it and read. I mean, that was a type of magic. So then to have such specialized knowledge to be able to take, I mean, not the building materials weren't even apparent. It's not like you go to Lowe's now and you pick up some 2x4 material. It's like this is under the earth. I have to dig the sand up and find my building material. It's just insane. So I don't think we're reading into it. I really don't. If anything, I think that people are dumbing this stuff down because it doesn't have to do with being intellectual. Really. And this is why I went from a quote unquote magical or ceremonial background. And I came into erudition, not because I wanted to be able to impress people with all the stuff I have crammed into my head that's pushing, basic important information out like phone numbers and names and things like that. It's because I wanted the context to reconstruct a holistic worldview to where I could understand what this stuff actually is instead of constantly interpolating and constantly projecting things onto it. Masonry, and I've had this conversation with Stuart Cleland, and he had a very wonderful counterpoint. And I agree with him. Masonry is such an effective thing because it's almost a blank canvas. Almost. You can project any number of the Western esoteric traditions or stuff in it. But I mean, when you really look at it, if we're just talking the building analogy, right? I was in Egypt recently, and you get taken around, and we had an Egyptologist who was guiding us and explaining things to us. And I didn't tell him I was a Mason or anything like that, but the parallel was uncanny, like in the literal sense of uncanny, like creepy, eerie. The analogy specifically to Egyptian building and Masonry, because they had their own lodges, they had their own rituals, and not only that, but they weren't carpenters. They worked only in stone. They were Masons.
Yeah, I've heard the story about discovering an obelisk, and then under it there's a square and a compass overlapping, right? And people have commented on that. And my thoughts are just like, well, these symbols naturally, you're going to need tools like that if you're working in stone. And so these symbols will just kind of come up because you're going to have the same thoughts about, well, there's the compasses and that's more heavenly, and there's the square that's more earthly, right? Which is another, I think, example of where we could go with ideal forms, right? With celestial and terrestrial. But yeah, you would think that they just kind of arise out of just the physicality of what's going on, just by the brute facts of what's going on.
Yeah, but the thing is, here's the other side of it. These people didn't have a worldview that was as materialistic as us. Granted, it's not to say they weren't materialists. They built monuments to themselves, right? I mean, they were, covered in gold. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it was virtually impossible to separate the almost absolute unity of their perspective. I would say every material thing has a spiritual counterpart or consequence, and vice versa. It's like, it's like having this thing right here. There's no way for me to move this and put it over here without this side going with it. And it's just kind of the same thing with matter and spirit to them. And that it becomes abundantly apparent. There's so many references. If I had to give one, okay, the solar bark of Ra and his retinue. He was the a solar deity, the principal wonder in the Middle Kingdom. He traveled on his solar bark through the heavens of the daytime and the underworld at night, right? But he had a retinue of gods on that solar boat, and one of them, the foremost, arguably, was Heka. That's magic. That's the word for magic in ancient Egyptian. Now, inclusion among this retinue of the gods is as almost as explicit as you can get, to saying these gods here, right? That's the reason. That's the reason they were on board this ship, is because they were meant to represent the forces that are responsible for both generating and maintaining physical existence. And magic is foremost among these things. So, it's, and there's tons of other examples, if you wanted to get around. But so the thing is, it's not only that they were doing the physical work, right? But how did they figure that out in the first place? Well, there's some sort of, in the most literal sense of the word, occult, right? There's a law here, a physical law that's hidden from my eyes. I can't see it. I can't perceive it without some sort of experimentation, some sort of, something informing my hypothesis that exists. And so what happens is, as these ancient builders, learned their art, they didn't just learn the physical, right? Because when you build something, the fact that it got built and stays built, right? Square, plumb, and level, right? I was a carpenter for a long time, and that's how you build things. You make sure it's square, you make sure it's plumb, you make sure it's level, right? These right angles, horizontals, and perpendiculars. Very, very important to the art of building. Things will fall down. It's hard to even get stuff up temporarily without those angles. But so you build something, and its existence is the proof of a law that you cannot see, and that to them, to me, is about as near to metaphysical as you can get. So, and yeah, obviously, it's in the pentagram as well, right? Because this gets translated to Vitruvian proportion, right? The architect Vitruvius, and then Leonardo da Vinci makes his Vitruvian Man, and then, depending on where you're starting, you have that very famous image of the circle and the square on Leonardo da Vinci, or his Vitruvian Man, the circle and the square together implying this whole idea of, right, the very famous yet intractable, centuries long, intractable geometrical problem of squaring the circle. It can't be done perfectly, but it becomes an analogy alchemically, hermetically, for spiritualizing the material. And, we see the square and compasses together in the lodge, and typically they're very near to the blazing star. Right? That's what a compass does. It draws a circle. That's what a square does. It draws a square.
Yeah. So it's you're saying that with the square and compasses that we might be alluding to squaring the circle.
Absolutely. That's my belief. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how the with the early Grand Lodge system that a lot of them were members of the Royal Society and scientists and believed in alchemy. And like I said earlier, we have operative and speculative alchemy, just like we have operative and speculative masonry. That you can see the parallels a little bit there, right? Where it's kind of squaring the circle. Is that a little bit of like the goal of alchemy is to what is that the
Well,
transmutation,
yeah.
becoming a better person. Do you think that that's a metaphor of self perfection, squaring the circle, or is it just a union of opposites?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I think that's you're saying the same thing. Perfection of the self is the union of opposites, but it's specifically the union of the spiritual and the material, which is what I was saying before, right? Embodying the archetype. Embody your archetype, right? That you said that you can't go back to an idea, right? The ideal, the abstract, I guess, Platonic form that is Ike, on a higher level, that's the spirit. That's the circle. Now I have to choose to square it, or really to allow it to circle me, and bridge the square and the circle, be both human and divine. And I don't mean that as like in a mythological sense, demigod. And this, what I mean is exactly what I'm saying is be the physical vehicle for the embodiment of spirit. That is what squaring the circle is from a spiritual perspective. Obviously, there's operative alchemy, but I will say this: as early as the 4th century, we have extant works from Zosimus of Panopolis, where he talks about specifically this, the idea that it was the dyeing of metals, really, that he was a scribe priest. He was a big deal, this guy. Right? He was one of the top dogs, but he was in charge of the metallurgist priests that were dyeing metals for religious statuary. And what he essentially taught his student Theosebia, a young Gnostic Christian woman at the time, was, in his various letters and his commentaries of the translations and commentaries that he made of former alchemists, he talked about how really it's a threefold alchemy, that you can work on the material, the metal, the transmutation of metals. You can work on the physical body and purify that too. And then there's another spiritual component. You can purify the spirit. So for people that say that it's like an interpolation, spiritual alchemy and the spiritual stuff, and alchemy was really early chemistry, it's like, well, I'm going to call bullshit, because we have something from, the 300s, an Egyptian scribe priest, Hellenistic scribe priest, talking about the spiritual and physical application of alchemy. Of course, back then he called it chirokmeta. They didn't call it alchemy, right? That comes really after the Perso-Arabic, the Islamic Empire kind of houses it for a little while because of all of the the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the anti-pagan edicts of Theodosius. It has to go parts eastward. It stays in and around Egypt for a while too, but really, al being the prefix the, and kimia being the Greek word for Egypt. Really, we think really it's alluding to Kem, meaning the black land, which was Egypt. So there's definitely that. And here's something of note to Masons. Zosimus penned a collection of what we call visions. They're the visions of Zosimus. Dr. Shannon Grimes has done amazing work on this in her book, Becoming Gold. That was put out by Rubido Press, I think 2017 or 2018. Fantastic work. I recommend everybody read it. But Zosimus is talking about in the visions certain things of an alchemical elemental nature. And they occur as the same way you would have to heat and beat a metal to get it to sort of change form. Well, he undergoes that as sort of this candidate in a ritual. And they are very reminiscent to, I guess I would put it this way, they appear to be penalties or punishments. He also talks about a staircase of 15 stairs that leads to an altar in his visions, and most appropriately in his work, he talks numerous times about acacia. So this is all specifically Hermetic, alchemical. He was pulling from Neoplatonism. He talked about Gnostic Christianity when he talked to Theosebia. So again, we're bringing it back to this Hellenistic seedbed of all of these ideas. And yeah, they make their way forward in time. Really, I would say if there is one lawful custodian, it's Masonry. So
yeah, with who was that had the staircase with 15 steps?
Zosimus of Panopolis.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up. It's interesting how often the staircases appear. And even, we were talking about the divided line, that's sometimes referred to as the ladder of knowledge, right? Which brings us back to the cave a little bit, right? With the whole, like, there's what's the lowest? The forms themselves, and then the symbols, and then the basic meaning, but then the whole what do we call, like, the geometric truths, right? And then we kind of rise up.
Of abstract meaning of that stuff.
Yeah, but it's interesting how even if Plato didn't intend theurgy, it's almost impossible not to read that into it, right?
Yeah.
And just the symbols on, Preston probably came up with the staircase idea. Really, where did that come from, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that the divided line is called the staircase of wisdom, because really, if you break out, it's representing phi in its proportions, the way that he's describing it. It's not overt, but if you draw it out, like I discovered it by accident by trying to replicate what he's saying to do, and I was like, oh wait, this is phi, this is lineal phi. But the thing is, now if you turn that into 1.618, on and on, it creates a logarithmic spiral, and that resembles like this kind of like, if you're looking at it head on and you turn it vertically, it resembles kind of like a spiral staircase. That is probably me reading into it and being way too pattern finding. But I still think it's interesting. That's like that visual just popped into my head when you said that.
Yeah, and I think I remember seeing somewhere a visualization where somebody like made a diagram of the divided line, and then, as you were saying, like those lengths of line can be used to create a pentagram, right? Uh,
Yeah,
and you wonder if the
because the
ancients, or if
pentagram
there's
has
explicit
five.
mention. Yeah, yeah. You wonder if there's any ancient, like, where they explicitly mention that, right? Because that's an interesting coincidence, if it is just a coincidence.
Yeah, that kind of stuff, the mathematical stuff, the geometric stuff, I'm convinced is not a coincidence, because we know for a fact that Pythagorean mysticism, you know, his school at Crotona, what his disciples talked about, what they wrote about, and the subsequent mathematical tradition that was transmitted through Platonic stuff, right? Plato talks about how, at certain points, he talks about how he works within a Pythagorean milieu, and then you have like the work of it's attributed to Iamblichus, but you have the Theoleguminatis Arithmeticus, the theology of arithmetic, right? It's attributed to Iamblichus. So you have this tradition where they were geometrizing constantly. But here's the thing: it was now I have a computer program that can do this. But they had to use these things. They had to find geometries out there with like an astrolabe, and then use a compass and a straight edge and mathematics to actually do this stuff. I mean, they would have. Here's the thing, and I don't ask you. I ask anybody that might be listening to this, particularly if they're brethren of the craft. How many times have you sat down to geometrically construct a figure? Whether it's the pentagram, or whether it's the Kabbalistic tree of life, or the tetrahedron. How many times have you done that? Well, I think that you should if you're a Mason. I think it's a very good exercise. And the personal gnosis that I've experienced is that as you are making these things, they are teaching you. But you're not going to understand that until you go and do it. Like you're not, it's not this mechanistic. It's like, if you're aware of in the process, if you allow yourself to kind of become immersed in it, these things teach you stuff. They really do. That's the experiential fact of sitting there and making these geometric figures, not just drawing them, but finding out the proportions. Right? Euclid is a great source for how to geometrically construct these different figures. Get a copy of Euclid. Go to the library. Get a PDF. Construct these things geometrically. Pay attention. And see what they're telling you, because they are telling you things, and it's incredible. It's mind blowing. And I think that if I'm some schmo from 2023 that's been doing this stuff for a couple of years, and I'm having these revelations, can you imagine what somebody whose consciousness hasn't been conditioned by smartphones and television and the internet, somebody truly more human, more present, likely in the moment, what revelations they may have come to in the process of geometrizing. Really, it's unbelievable the way that shapes can communicate to you.
Mhm.
And the fact that your mind as a human being possesses the wherewithal, that je ne sais quoi, that faculty that remains unnamed, that X variable, to be able to perceive this stuff. I mean, there's something mystical there, really. There's something we're never going to be able to describe there. And I don't think it was an accident. I think they really encoded this stuff into particularly the geometric stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So maybe we'll start wrapping up. Before we do, is there anything else you wanted to mention, or any loose ends?
Um, I'm sure there's plenty of loose ends, but I wanted to thank you for having me on and facilitating this discussion. I really appreciate the time you take with your questions to be insightful and thoughtful, and to really contribute to the conversation. I appreciate that. So I'm very happy to be here and to do this with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, for everybody that's watching, check out the YouTube channel. You have more subscribers than I do, so you're probably doing me more of a favor by coming on mine. But yeah, check out everybody. Check out the channel Arcanum with a V, Arcane VM, and yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
you
so
can
much.
also
Yeah,
you can also check me out at ikebaker.com, IKEBAKER. Uh so that's basically got everything embedded. So you can listen to the podcast, stream the latest video, read the blog, and write me a message, all from one page. So you can check that out. Um and that's about it. And hey man, you're doing me a favor by allowing me to come on, and because I don't have that many more subscribers than you, but to come on and to talk about this stuff and create a dialogue. I think, as a lot of people, as you could tell, I'm probably very, you can probably tell I'm very passionate about these things. So anytime I get a chance to like sit down and be a little off the cuff, is like it just helps tremendously. It's I enjoy it. So thank you.
yeah, absolutely. It's fun, and it's a topic that I love to talk about too, and all the everything to do with masonry, and absolutely. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you everybody for watching.